When James Anderson fired his gardener, accusing him of theft, he had no idea that this decision would lead to the collapse of his business and a rift with his family. Now, faced with threats and the reappearance of the very man he banished, he realizes that the past demands a reckoning. The events that follow will shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. James Anderson, a successful businessman and heir to a vast fortune, was known for his strict demeanor and high standards, both in work and in his personal life. His estate, inherited from his father, was a paragon of order and luxury, reflecting his rigid character. Every corner of his property was meticulously maintained, and every tree or shrub was perfectly trimmed, thanks to his young gardener, Evan, who had been working there for several years. Evan wasn't just an employee, he seemed dedicated and responsible, and although James was reserved, he trusted him. One evening, after a tough day at work, James decided to spend a few minutes in his study to unwind and admire his collection of antique items, which held special value for him. Among these treasures, a pair of old pocket watches passed down from his grandfather held a particularly important place. They had been given to him as a symbol of heritage and family tradition. He always took pride in these watches and loved sharing their story with friends and colleagues, showing them off as a reminder of his status and roots. But upon opening the cabinet, James discovered the watches were gone. At first he froze, unable to believe his eyes. His heart started to race as he frantically searched every shelf, checking every nook and drawer. But the watches, which had always been in their place, had vanished without a trace. A wave of panic and anger swept over him. Someone must have taken them, and that someone was someone within his circle. Struggling to control his rage, James pressed the call button, summoning all staff and family members to the main hall. Gathering everyone, he cast a heavy accusatory gaze upon them. "I haven't just lost an object. This was a family heirloom, a part of my family's history. Someone stole it," he declared loudly and coldly, not hiding his irritation. An oppressive silence hung in the air. The staff exchanged glances, while his wife, Elizabeth, and son, Alex, looked at him with concern. No one dared to break the silence until James fixed his stare on Evan, who stood at the far end of the hall, his head bowed. "Evan," James said sharply, "you've worked in my house for several years. You have access to the entire estate, including my study. You're often in my rooms when I'm not around. Was it you who decided to betray my trust?" Evan raised his eyes, and they were filled with surprise and desperation. He took a step forward, trying to explain. "Mr. Anderson, I swear, I never did this. I work here honestly, and I would never allow myself to steal anything. Please, believe me." But James was no longer listening. In his mind, the picture was clear. Only someone with access to every corner of the house could have committed the theft, and the gardener fit that description perfectly. Despite Evan's pleas and attempts to prove his innocence, James remained steadfast. He called security and ordered them to escort Evan off the property immediately. "You've lost my trust, and I don't want to see you here anymore," he stated coldly. Evan, shocked and hurt, tried one last time to explain himself, but was roughly pushed aside by the guards. The young man, leaving the estate, glanced back, and his eyes met those of Alex, James's son, who stood apart, watching the scene with obvious confusion and concern. Elizabeth, James's wife, approached him and tried to persuade him to reconsider his decision. "James, this isn't like you, to make decisions so quickly. You've always been fair. Can't you at least give him a chance to explain himself?" But James was adamant. "I can't take the risk. You can't trust anyone, even those who seem close. Betrayal can come from anywhere," he firmly declared, showing that his decision was final. As Evan left the estate, he felt empty. This place was more than just a job for him. It had become a part of his life, and he genuinely cared for the Anderson family. He couldn't believe he was being accused of something he didn't do. James' family, watching this unfold, remained in turmoil. Elizabeth and Alex were unsure if James had done the right thing, but they knew it would be impossible to change his mind. James, closing the doors to his study, felt he had done the right thing. Yet inside, there remained a strange sense of unease, as if something about the situation was off. But he chose to ignore it, convincing himself that his instincts wouldn't betray him. A year passed since the incident with the missing watches, and outwardly, James Anderson's life seemed stable as ever. His business still functioned, and his estate maintained its impeccable appearance, but inside, everything was beginning to fall apart. The events of a year ago had become an invisible crack that was gradually destroying both his personal life and his work. In recent months, James's business began experiencing difficulties. Suddenly, problems with suppliers emerged. Deals fell through, and his competitors, as if conspiring, began to encroach on his position. His company, which once seemed unshakable, was now facing losses. Constant reports of declining revenues and financial crises loomed over him, and his confidence in his own decisions started to waver. Every morning, he woke up feeling that something was slipping away, and that all his efforts were yielding no results. Moreover, tensions within the Anderson family were rising. His son, Alex, who had always been a source of pride and support for James, began to argue with his father more frequently. Alex hadn't forgotten how James fired Evan a year ago, and believed his father had acted wrongly. "You condemned an innocent man, Dad. I don't understand how you could do that," Alex would say when they revisited the incident. "You always said that justice was most important, but now I see that your ego and reputation matter more." These words hurt James, but rather than admitting the possibility of a mistake, he reacted with irritation and stubbornness. "You're too young to understand how the world works, Alex. I was protecting our family and our legacy," James responded bitterly. Conflicts between them grew sharper and more frequent, often occurring in Elizabeth's presence, who tried to reconcile them, but her efforts were in vain. One evening, when James came home late from the office after yet another unsuccessful day, he noticed something strange at the doorstep. Among the mail and promotional brochures lay an unmarked envelope. James picked it up, feeling a slight unease, and carefully opened it. Inside was a small note with a simple yet alarming message. "All secrets come to light. You made a mistake, and the consequences are near." These words made his heart stop. He looked around but saw nothing suspicious. The street was empty, and the house was silent. James went inside and shut the door behind him, trying to understand the note's meaning. Who could have sent this? What was the threat? He recalled the watch incident and Evan, but even then, he was reluctant to admit that he might have made a mistake. James convinced himself that it was merely an attempt to intimidate him, but the sense of unease remained. That night, he couldn't sleep. Lying in the dark, James thought about the past year and how his business and family began gradually falling apart. He realized something had gone wrong, but he still wasn't ready to acknowledge that his own stubbornness and short-sightedness might have been the cause. "I didn't make a mistake," he repeated to himself. "I'm doing everything right." But the inner voice, reminding him of the note and Alex's words, wouldn't let him find peace. A shadow of doubt began to creep into his thoughts, and for the first time, James felt fear for his future. The next morning, James woke up with a heavy heart and a sense of impending doom. The night had been filled with restless thoughts, and he had barely gotten any sleep. Running the content of the anonymous note through his mind, he grew increasingly convinced that someone was deliberately trying to manipulate him or exploit his vulnerability in business. But the identity of the person behind this remained a mystery. Making himself a strong cup of coffee, he stepped out onto the terrace to clear his head and breathe in the morning air. As soon as he stepped onto the stairs, his gaze fell upon a figure slowly moving through his garden. In the glow of the morning sun, he recognized a familiar face. It was Evan. James froze, and a wave of anger and anxiety surged within him. What was this man, whom he had fired a year ago, doing on his property? Could he be back for revenge? Flashed through his mind. Gathering his thoughts and mustering his courage, James strode forward decisively, heading toward Evan. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice louder than he had anticipated. Evan stopped, turning and raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I need to talk to you, Mr. Anderson. It's important," he replied calmly. Despite his anger and suspicions, James decided to listen. He understood that if Evan had returned, he must have a good reason. Inside the house, they sat across from each other in the study where, a year ago, James had decided to fire Evan. This time, the atmosphere was entirely different. Tense, but less hostile. Evan began to speak. "After you fired me, I struggled to find work for a long time. But eventually, I got hired by one of your competitors, Mr. Harrington. He was eager to employ someone who knew your business from the inside." James frowned, feeling a pang of jealousy and worry, but he remained silent. "At first, it seemed like a good opportunity," Evan continued. "But soon, I started noticing strange things in Harrington's operations. His company was involved in shady deals, and I discovered several transactions that directly targeted your business." James leaned in, his interest evident. "What kind of transactions?" he asked, unable to hide his concern. "Mr. Anderson, over the past year, your company lost several major contracts. Harrington and his people didn't just manipulate the terms to snatch them from you. They knew exactly when and which deals you had lined up, and they used this information against you," Evan explained, looking James straight in the eyes. "I know this may sound strange, but I have evidence that not only explains why you've been losing deals, but can also help you rebuild your business. I know who within your company has been feeding information to your competitors." James listened intently, his face growing increasingly tense. He realized that sitting before him was not just a former gardener, but someone who genuinely possessed crucial information. But one thing still bothered him. "Why are you choosing to help me?" James asked, clearly distrustful of Evan's sudden goodwill. Evan sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I'm not here to accuse you or seek revenge. All I want is justice. On that day, you fired me without hearing me out, and I lost everything. I don't want compensation or money. I want you to acknowledge your mistake and publicly apologize. That's all I need. If you do that, I will help you save your company." James froze for a moment. A public apology? That meant admitting his mistake in front of everyone, his family, his partners, his entire social circle. It would destroy his image as a strong and infallible leader. He knew it would damage his reputation, but he also understood that without Evan's help, his business might not survive. The situation was becoming increasingly complicated, and James felt for the first time just how much his past decision was affecting his present. "I'll think about your proposal," James replied coldly, trying to maintain an appearance of control, but inside, he was already struggling with a mix of fear, shame, and doubt. In the days following his conversation with Evan, James Anderson found himself in a deep internal crisis. His pride, which had always helped him maintain control over his business and life, was now turning against him. He was not accustomed to admitting mistakes, let alone apologizing to anyone, especially publicly. But the situation surrounding his company was worsening by the day, and pressure was mounting from all sides. Supply issues were worsening, and key partners began pulling out of deals, citing the company's instability. James received daily calls from shareholders demanding explanations and action plans. The atmosphere in the office was tense, and employees whispered behind his back, questioning whether their boss could keep the company afloat. He felt as though everything he had built over the years was collapsing beneath him. But the most painful pressure came from his family. His wife, Elizabeth, saw how her husband's condition was deteriorating and tried to support him. But more and more often, their conversations turned into arguments. She reminded him of the incident a year ago, how his impulsive decision to fire Evan without proof had sparked conflicts within the family. "James, you were too harsh back then," she said. "Maybe it's time to admit you were wrong." Her words were full of care, but they wounded his pride. Their son, Alex, also continued to openly criticize his father. "You've backed yourself into this corner, Dad," he said, showing his disappointment. "If you had just been willing to hear Evan out back then, none of this might have happened." Alex's words, from a son who had once been James's pride and support, now cut like a knife. He felt the growing distance between them, and it pained him more than any business issue. Every evening, James stayed alone in his study, flipping through financial reports and searching for a solution. He knew he had a choice. Either continue fighting alone and risk losing everything, or accept Evan's offer and take a step he had never imagined, publicly apologizing. This step would mean shattering his flawless image in the eyes of his colleagues, partners, and most importantly, himself. His internal conflict reached its peak. What's more important, pride or saving the company? James wondered, staring into the dark window of his study. He understood that if he ignored Evan's offer, it could mean the end of his business. But the thought of having to bow his head before a former gardener tormented him, making him feel vulnerable. At one of the shareholder meetings, his partner and childhood friend Richard also spoke up. James, we've been through a lot together, and I know you as a strong leader. But sometimes, even the strongest need to acknowledge their mistakes to move forward. Richard's words, from someone who had always supported him, made James think. Perhaps it was time to act differently. Finally, one night when he still couldn't sleep, James realized that his stubbornness and pride were not only causing problems in his business, but were also destroying his relationships with loved ones. He recalled Evan's face when he had asked for a chance to explain himself, and remembered the words of his son and wife who had tried to reach him. He realized that his need to always be right and in control had turned against him. In the morning, he made a decision. Convening an emergency meeting with the board of directors and his family, James announced that he was ready to accept Evan's offer. I admit I made a mistake. I am willing to apologize to him publicly if it means saving the company and restoring our business, he said, his voice firm, though his eyes showed a hint of tension and uncertainty. Elizabeth and Alex exchanged glances, and relief appeared on their faces. They knew this step hadn't come easily for James, but it showed he was willing to change for the sake of his family and the greater good. Despite the weight of his decision, James felt for the first time in a long while that he had made the right choice. James Anderson knew that the moment of truth had arrived. He organized a press conference, inviting not only journalists and business partners, but also his employees and family members. This was his chance to change everything, but also a risk. If his words did not resonate, he could lose everything for good. Standing in front of the mirror in his office, he adjusted his tie and looked at his reflection. For the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable and nervous. When the time came, James stepped onto the podium, his face serious, but his gaze resolute. The lights from the cameras and the flashes of the photographers were blinding, but he focused on delivering his message. Taking a deep breath, James began. Today, I stand before you to admit my mistake. A year ago, I accused and dismissed someone without evidence. It was a wrong decision, driven by emotion and bias. I want to apologize to him and to everyone affected by this situation. He paused, and a heavy silence hung in the air. James could see his employees and partners listening with a mix of surprise and, in some cases, admiration. I apologize to Evan, the person I wrongfully accused and deprived of his livelihood. I understand that my decision back then was hasty and that it caused him harm. I also want to apologize to my family and to all the employees whom I let down with my behavior, he continued, his voice sincere and filled with emotion. These words stirred a wave of sympathy and approval in the room. People who had previously doubted his leadership now saw a man capable of acknowledging his faults and changing. Some of the staff, who had once feared his harshness and uncompromising nature, now looked at him with newfound respect. His colleagues, partners, and shareholders present at the event began to applaud, showing they were ready to support him and his company. After the press conference concluded, James returned to his office, feeling a sense of relief mixed with trepidation about what might come next. He knew that a single apology wouldn't solve everything. He had to prove he was willing to take action to restore justice. Later that same day, James met with Evan in his office. Thank you for agreeing to my proposal, James said, extending his hand. Evan nodded and replied, I respect what you did, Mr. Anderson, but I didn't come here just for an apology. I came to help you fix the situation. He pulled out a folder and a USB drive containing information he had gathered while working for James's competitor. James and Evan began reviewing the data together. As they sifted through the files, they uncovered that the schemes undermining James's business were orchestrated by a trusted member of his inner circle, his longtime assistant, Peter. Peter had used his position to relay critical information about the company's plans to competitors and had even orchestrated the theft of the pocket watch to divert suspicion and create conflict within the estate. It had served his purpose to pit James against a loyal employee and mask his own manipulations. When the truth emerged, James felt a surge of anger mixed with a deep sense of betrayal. Peter had been more than just an assistant. He had been a confidant. But now, James understood that Peter had been manipulating his trust for years. With Evan's help, James compiled the evidence, and together they organized a meeting with legal and law enforcement authorities to expose Peter and his schemes. Soon after, Peter was arrested, along with others involved in the fraudulent activities that had harmed James's company. When the truth came to light, many of the company's employees and partners regained their faith in James, seeing that he was committed to fighting for the truth and justice, even when it meant facing uncomfortable truths about his own decisions and relationships. At that moment, James realized that wealth and success were meaningless without honesty and trust. He had lost much due to his pride, but through acknowledging his mistakes and accepting Evan's support, he managed not only to rebuild his business, but also to transform himself. He offered Evan a partnership in the company, recognizing that he had earned that trust and knowing that together they could achieve far more. The story concluded with James and Evan becoming partners, working to restore both the company and the trust that had once seemed irreparably broken. They embarked on a new chapter, and for the first time in a long while, James felt free from the burden of past mistakes, ready to build a future on a foundation of honesty and integrity.